Tyrannosaurus rex was the fearsome tyrant lizard king that roamed the earth during the— okay, I don't have to tell you this. You know what a T-Rex is. You've heard of a T-Rex before. But our friend Rex wasn't the only tyrannosaur. They had around 30 species cousins, including one guy called Nano Tyrannus. Based on the fossils we've found so far, we think Nanotyrannus lived in the same time and place as T-Rex, but was about half the length of their bigger cousins. But there's a slight problem. Nanotyrannus might not actually exist. Our story starts in 1942 when a paleontologist unearthed a dinosaur skull from a rock formation in Montana called Hell Creek, which is also where the very first T-Rex skeleton was found 40 years prior. Lately, it's referred to as the Cleveland skull after the museum it's kept in, and that's also how we're going to refer to it in this video. But the reason for the nickname is at least partly because nobody can agree on what species it even is. It was originally identified as a Gorgosaurus, which is also in the Tyrannosaurid group. Tyrannosaurid just means the entire family of nearly 30 tyrant lizard species, so T-Rex and all its close cousins. Now, Gorgosaurus is closely related to another species, Albertosaurus, and they look so much alike that for a while researchers weren't sure if the two were actually part of the same species or not, which is kind of our theme for today. At that time, the Cleveland skull was thought to be a Gorgosaurus, so it got a bunch of extra attention while people were trying to settle that debate. And all that extra attention turned out to have a pretty unexpected result. In 1988, a team of 3 paleontologists pointed out that the Cleveland skull was pretty different from the other Gorgosaurs, but it didn't look like the Albertosaurs either. So they reclassified it as a new species, Nanotyrannus lencensis. These guys looked a lot like T-Rex, but were about half the length and a fraction of the weight. T-Rex could grow up to 12 meters long and weigh over 7,000 kilograms. On the other hand, models estimating how Nanotyrannus grew put it at roughly 5 meters long and somewhere between 900 and 1,500 kilograms, which isn't tiny, but it certainly wasn't winning any wrestling matches against its bigger cousins. So we have these fossils that are 2 completely different sizes, but look kinda similar to each other, which got researchers wondering about whether Nanotyrannus really was its own species, or if it was a young T-Rex. Like we said, the Cleveland skull was found in the same fossil deposits where we found T-Rex, which means they were both alive at the same time. Plus, paleontologists had suggested the Cleveland skull might just be a young T-Rex as early as 1965, before anyone was talking about nano anything. And in the decades since then, there's been a ton of debate over whether Nanotyrannus is actually just a Tyrannosaurus rex. So the new goal is to figure out how old the animals that we're calling Nanotyrannus were. One thing we can look at is cranial sutures, or the joints between the bones of the skull. These sutures only fuse when an animal's head is done growing, at least in vertebrates. So if you find a dino with unfused skull bones, we think that guy had some more growing to do. So the researchers studying the Cleveland skull in 1988 determined that the skull bones were fused, so therefore it was all grown up. However, later research suggested that suture closure isn't always a good way to determine adulthood in dinosaurs, meaning that the Cleveland skull may have belonged to a juvenile after all. There is, of course, a third option, which is that the Cleveland skull is from a young dinosaur, but that it's from a young Nanotyrannus, not a T-Rex. Which brings us to the next development in the mystery when another controversial Tyrannosaurid skeleton nicknamed Jane was found in 2001. In some ways, that skeleton looked just like a typical teenage T-Rex. Say that 3 times fast. But Jane was also kinda weird. Like, the skull had more teeth than an adult T-Rex would, and the whole skull shape just didn't quite match with other T-Rex skulls. Researchers also think that this skeleton is probably a juvenile, but that it was a few years older than the original Nanotyrannus specimen, so it had more growing to do, but exactly how much isn't totally clear. So we think that Jane and the Cleveland skull are the same thing, but the problem is that nobody can agree whether that thing is a Nanotyrannus or a young T-Rex. And all of this is pointing to a bigger problem in dinosaur paleontology, which is that we don't always have fossils of the same animals at lots of different ages. And that's an especially big problem for dinos because they change a lot as they grow, which is completely fair given that they all hatched out of eggs that were pretty puny compared to their full-grown selves. Like, even the Titanosaurs hatched from eggs the size of a football, and some of them grew up to be about 26 meters long, or about about 91 footballs, in case you want to keep measuring things that way. The reason for these tiny eggs is more about the shell than the embryo inside. See, eggshells need to be thin enough to allow gases to pass through them, and if you increase the size of the egg without thickening the shell, it ends up being pretty fragile. So to avoid a dinosaur scramble, the eggs have to stay tiny, which means you end up with adult animals that really look nothing like their baby pictures. And some of these changes aren't just about looks. In some cases, researchers think that baby dinosaurs could even be adapted to eat different foods than their parents did. This would mean they could occupy completely different niches in an ecosystem at different points in their life, which is called ontogenetic niche shift. It's a neat trick because it means you and your older group mates don't have to share food. But those adaptations also often come with morphological changes, meaning there's even more ways that young dinos can look different from their adult counterparts. For paleontologists today, all this means it's pretty difficult to be sure a smaller version of a dinosaur is the same species as a bigger version, especially if we don't have fossils of many of the in-between steps. And if Nanotyrannus really does turn out to be a baby T-Rex, that wouldn't be the first time that paleontologists had gotten mixed up when looking at different dino ages. In 1879, O.C. Marsh classified a new group of dinosaurs called camptosaurs. They were large, plant-eating dinosaurs that lived in what's now North America and Europe during the late Jurassic. The first species named was Camptosaurus dispar. It was 6 meters long, walked on all fours, and it had a huge gut but short arms. Over the next 15 years, 2 other species were found, which were named Camptosaurus medius and Camptosaurus nanus. They both kinda looked like C. dispar, except that they had smaller guts, and researchers thought they walked on 2 legs instead of 4. But 100 years later, more careful analysis revealed that the littlest one was really just a tiny Camptosaurus dispar. And while we're fairly sure that the littlest camptosaur isn't really its own species, a 2008 study suggested that Camptosaurus medius may still be its own thing after all. Mix-ups like this are way more common than you'd think. One researcher estimates as many as a third of dinosaur species might actually be juveniles of other species. But luckily, we do have some tools to help figure this out. Scientists can estimate the age of a fossil using a technique called histology to look at cross-sections of dino bones. See, bones don't just grow longer or wider, they get thicker too. And year over year, that results in growth rings, basically like tree rings. And just like with trees, you can count the rings to figure out how old the owner of that bone was when they died. Funny enough, people on both sides of the Nanotyrannus debate use growth ring evidence to argue their case. A study published in 2020 took a careful look at the microscopic structure of 2 potential Nanotyrannus fossils and found that they were approximately 13 and 15 years old. Since we think that T-Rex stopped growing at around 20 years old, that means that if these fossils are T-Rex individuals, they really are juveniles. Those researchers argued that with a decent teenage growth spurt, these 2 fossils could easily end up looking just like adult T-Rex. But this wasn't the end for Nanotyrannus. Just 4 years later, a 2024 study also looked at the histology of the same fossils and came to a very different conclusion. Those researchers argued that the rate of growth in these bones seemed to be slowing down, not speeding up, as you'd expect with an impending growth spurt. And at that growth rate, there'd be no way they could reach the size of T-Rex by adulthood. They also pointed out the theropod in the room, which is that we do have other fossils of younger T-Rex that don't look like Nanotyrannus. So it seems like a weird move for them to go from looking T-Rexy as babies, then doing this totally different thing in their mid-teens, only to go back to what they were doing before when they reach maturity. And thus, the debate rages on with a ton of evidence on both sides. This is probably one of those times where we just don't have all of the fossils we need to answer our questions, so finding more samples is the only way forward. The good news is, we may already have one. You may have even heard of this fossil, or rather these fossils. The dueling dinosaurs are fossils of 1 young T-Rex and 1 Triceratops that were locked in combat up until the moment they died and were fossilized together. And some researchers have speculated that these so-called young T-Rex may actually be a Nanotyrannus. This fossil was found way back in 2006 by a private company, but because of some legal issues, researchers haven't really had a chance to study the duo. The dueling dinos were donated to a museum in North Carolina in 2020, and researchers are already making up for lost time. If the Tyrannosaur is just the right age, it could be the missing piece we need to understand exactly what happened to T-Rex as they grew, or it could cement the position of Nanotyrannus as its own thing on the Tyrannosaurid family tree. And hey, whether or not this one fossil solves the whole Nanotyrannus mystery or not, at the very least, we get to know more about the sickest dino fight ever. Thanks for checking out this episode of SciShow. If you've got a little juvenile in your life, they may enjoy checking out our sister channel, SciShow Kids. A great episode to start with is this one, which is a kid-friendly introduction to that time the non-bird dinosaurs roamed the planet. Because, come on, what kid doesn't like dinosaurs?